Hey, Sam.
Hey, Vern.
Glad to be having this conversation. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Andy Vernon-Jones. I've been a fan of Black Bear since Black Bear came into the world in about 2005. But I've also known you as Sam Beebe and been a fan and friend of yours since sometime back around 1989. And excited to get to talk to you about this phase of your music making career, and specifically here to talk about the song "Overflow the Borders" today.
Well, first of all, I should respond in kind to the excitement that you expressed there on the top about being able to have this conversation with you, and for it to be really the first time that I've been able to have an extended conversation that was recorded about any piece of music that I made. And as I said to you, given how many countless hours I've spent listening to interviews of other creative people talking about the things they've made, it feels like a really welcome thing to finally be doing, even if we're just sort of doing this homemade version. That's all everything is these days anyway, just homemade.
It is.
There are a lot of elements to this song that will be sort of mysteries to the average listener. There's certain things in this song that reference points that only make sense to me and about three other people: my wife, Vicky, and her mother and her brother.
Just the text exchange that we were having about the song was illuminating all these facets of it that made me even more interested than I was just through the several close listens that I had been giving it when the song was when I first got to hear it on Patreon. So this is my first time doing this as well, and very excited. So let's jump into the song. Where did the ideas that this song originates from start? Was it a musical or instrumental spark, or did it begin because it's so musically dense and lyrically dense? Mm-hmm. I'd love to know where the beginning point was.
Yeah, so there are two beginning points that occurred actually separate from each other, and then they converged into this song by force of nature because they were always meant to be together. But the one that came first was me starting to make this track. I had been going through the vinyl collection of Vicky's father, who's no longer alive. He passed away in 2007. Which was right when we met. But I did get to meet him. His name was Velichko Pechev. And Velichko was a political refugee from the communist regime in Bulgaria. He escaped under very exciting circumstances with his first wife and his son. Well, let me just back up. Why did he want to get out of Bulgaria, and why did the communist regime not want that to happen? So he worked for the Ministry of Tourism. As such, he traveled a lot. He traveled in the West, as it would have been called to them back then, and maybe still, quite a bit. And he spoke multiple languages. And he went to Japan. He went to Mexico, and it became clear through the rumor mill to the Bulgarian KGB, who was keeping tabs on absolutely everybody, that he was a Western sympathizer. At a point, he had been told that he was prioritized on a kind of watch list. And for fear of loss of freedom, or for fear of being imprisoned or worse, he arranged with some sort of Italian diplomat that he had met on travels to Italy, who bribed border guards at the Bulgarian border with, I think, what is now Slovenia, or no, it would have been Yugoslavia. The deal was that he and his wife and his child, they would drive to the border, and they would get out of the car and leave the car on the Bulgarian side of the border and just walk with the clothes on their back. And maybe they had some bags with them or some suitcases. They would walk over the border, not make eye contact with the guards, and just not look back and keep walking until they met this Italian diplomat, who then picked them up and took them to Rome. And that's where he started his life in the West. And so, for the sharp listener, and for you now who's been listening sharply for a few days, you're already starting to pick up on some of the references, I'm sure. But nothing can be fully seen until
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I of course knew that your father-in-law, had been had escaped from communist Bulgaria. Your late father-in-law, but already all these details that I didn't know are jiving with lines in the song, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
understanding so much more. So you said you were listening. Did you say you were
Yeah.
listening to his
Okay.
record?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I am the king of meaningful tangents, as I like to think of them. But there's also just so much to say about this song and its making. So I was listening to his. We're living here in Germany now, in the house that my wife Vicky grew up in, and my studio, where I write and work on music and other creative projects, is what was once Velichko's old studio. Vili, I might refer to him as Vili sometimes. That's what he was really known as to the family and to most of the people who knew him. And so I'm in his old studio with a lot of his old stuff, and I started picking at his vinyl collection, which is a very odd assortment of things, but it included a couple of records of old Bulgarian folk music. And so, there's one in particular just really jumped out at me, and I still listen to it a lot. And because they just have these haunting, I don't know the correct music terminology for it, but these haunting harmonies. And it's mostly, it's very much vocal led. It's a lot of voices at once. Usually the female vocals are in the forefront, and they just have this piercing kind of quality to them. And some of the melodic moments I just really have fallen in love with. And so I started, and I immediately, I start thinking about sampling them, because I've always been interested in sample-based music, and I've never actually made much. And so I started playing with this one sample just with basically nothing else. Maybe I had a drum beat next to it, and I just started messing with it and messing with it. And eventually I got this thing, which is the first thing that you hear in the song, and which runs in and out throughout the whole song. And it just immediately, I was like, this is something special. This is super interesting to me. It has some of these qualities of these choral songs that I like so much, but it's very modern sounding. It clearly appeals to my sort of hip hop history, and which is a history that you and I share very deeply. So that's one moment happening. And I think that happened first. And then at some point in the summer, when I was thinking about things to write songs about, just, thinking more lyrically, I started coming, just naturally coming into a couple of rhyming couplets about our travels in Bulgaria. My wife and I have been to Bulgaria twice now, so, since her father passed away. And she still has a few relatives that are there that we visit in Sofia, but otherwise we've traveled around the whole country. Both times that we went, we basically did a loop around, a large loop around a lot of the country. And should just say it's a stunningly beautiful country, and it surprised me in so many ways. There's gorgeous mountains. The seaside is beautiful, beautiful beaches. Just this really amazing rustic villages. There's a couple of cities that have very unique architectural styles to them, and dramatic vistas and castles, and Sofia itself is a really interesting city. It's this city that once was a kind of Western city, which then got basically shut down for a long period of time. Its sort of grandeur got shut down, and has since been sort of slowly revived since communism fell in 1989. But it's still pretty run down in certain ways, and it's a poor country. Somebody told me, I didn't know this actually. I knew it was one of the poorest countries in the EU, but it is the poorest. I'll have to check that after the fact. And you do feel that, everywhere you go, you feel that, but there is also a sort of, there is a cosmopolitan element that's there. And so I started, flip back forward to this summer, I started writing lyrics that had just sort of popped into my head using, with some of the words, place names, food names that I really sort of relish. The Bulgarian language is mostly completely out of my reach, except for when it comes to certain place names, places that I've been and food that I've eaten. And so I think actually the first stanza that I wrote was a simple meal in a field, kashkaval and bread. The simpler is the pleasure, the more the soul is fed. So kashkaval is a kind of cheese, Bulgarian cheese.
A simple meal in a field, kashkaval and bread. The simpler is the pleasure, the more the soul is fed.
I'm glad you're talking about these Bulgarian words, because I resisted the urge to Google every reference and every word that I wasn't familiar with, but I did look up Vitosha. In the first verse, there's the line, "The vigilance of Vitosha looms over the city, commanding blind devotion."
Descent into Sofia, the vigilance of Vitosha looms over the city, commanding blind devotion.
Yeah. And I thought that this might be a term that referred to the Bulgarian secret police or a corrupt politician or something that was commanding devotion. But Vitosha is actually, at least according to Google, just a mountain. So why is the mountain commanding devotion, or where does that metaphor come from?
Yeah, so Vitosha is one. It's very close to the city, and it is kind of always looming over the city. You can see it from kind of everywhere you go in the city. There's a kind of oppressive atmosphere that you can still feel, and so I sort of attributed it to Vitosha, this big mountain which does loom over the city, and I think Bulgarians do have a devotion, especially Sofians have a devotion to Vitosha, and actually they probably would say it Vitosha, but that didn't work as well for the rhythm of the song. There is a kind of devotion which I decided, as a sort of reference to communism, and sort of the way the population had little other choice than to sort of be blindly devoted to the regime. It just felt fitting.
That's great. Well, let's go from there to pulling back to some of the sort of even more universal themes beyond the specific family stories that kind of build the song structure and narrative. Each verse of the song ends with this refrain, "If you want freedom, first you find it within." That's an idea that I think a lot of different philosophers and poets have expressed in their different ways. Where did that idea first take on meaning for you, or how does it connect to you or to your ideas about your father-in-law's experience?
I knew at a certain point that, once I started bringing in the Vicky's father, Vili's narrative, that this would be a song about freedom, ultimately about achieving freedom that is otherwise being suppressed or attempting to be suppressed. And I was just thinking about how, this idea that wanting to feel free or feeling free was the very thing that they didn't want him to have. They didn't want anybody to feel free. But he had felt freedom from within, maybe a little bit from without too, having been one of the very few Bulgarians at that time who got to travel outside of the borders of the country. And so he found it within first, and without having found it within and realizing how important it was, he never would have been as motivated as he was to leave, and his flight was both a motivation of his own desire and probably also, out of fear for his own life or protection for himself and his family. Yeah. So then it just came into this line, "If you want freedom, first you find it within." They can take it from the outside, but not from where it begins, because as somebody who's enjoyed a huge amount of freedom my whole life, I wanted also to be very careful to not have it be some sort of chorus that's like, that completely disregards the fact that people's freedoms are all the time, all over the world, being taken away from them, and that they can, and you can't just say like, hey, freedom is just in the mind, so that was important to me, that there was that also this, like, because I do believe in this idea that it does exist within, and we all have heard stories of people's resilience of freedom within, despite having huge curtailments of their freedom from without, which is, obviously it's just an inherently inspiring thing. And then when it is able to manifest in the way that it did in his case, where he actually then seizes freedom and is manages with this sort of miraculous help and this loophole that he finds, it's like literally a loophole in the fence, thanks to money.
Yeah, good. Well, let's continue talking about that idea of freedom. In the second section of the chorus, the line that the song title is taken from, fight only for the right to overflow the borders. You're not just saying cross the borders there, but overflow, which seems like such a powerful sentiment about political borders and maybe any other kind of borders. Tell us about that idea.
Yeah, this is where the pre-chorus into the chorus is where I really start mixing the specifics of the narrative into more universal ideas. And I knew that I had to do that, writing a song that's so specific and which is threaded through with so many reference points that nobody would ever understand, even if they are interesting for that reason, or they sound interesting, and it have a sort of mystery to it. But I knew, of course, that like if I wanted to make this a song that could travel further than a small sphere, that the sort of overarching message and ideas explored would be ones that are universal. And of course, that's what every good piece of art does that's based on something specific. It's exploring something that's much larger and more broadly applicable. And so Overflow the Borders this is a term that I come back to again and again, some version of it. I can trace it back to this small piece of writing by the French writer John Berger. Well, actually, I think he was English, but he lived in France for much of his life. He's an art critic, an essayist, and a novelist. He has this piece, this short piece called On Visibility. There's this great line about how everything has the quality of clouds, that it assembles into visibility and then eventually dissipates into invisibility. He gets into this idea that because visibility is this ever fluid kind of thing, that existence itself is akin to this sort of appearing and gathering into visibility, a life that comes into being and then eventually dissipates into invisibility. He says everything has this quality, every single unit of life or material that exists shares this quality. And he says, the ant has it just as much as the mountain has it. I don't know if it's a specific line where he says overflow the borders, but that's the term that's always sort of come out of it and come back around for me the most. And I find that I bring this concept into a lot of the stuff that I write, because it just feels so applicable to me that nothing is ever containable, because all of the borders are porous and nothing is ever fixed, no concept, no entity. This porousness of everything, and the fact that, and this ends up sort of nicely drifting into two ideas of universality and everything being connected, everything being a part of one holistic, or at least whole, of fabric of the universe.
If you want freedom, first you find it within. They can take it from the outside, but not from where it begins. Reflections in the rear view may appear closer than they are, but nothing can be fully seen until you ditch the car.
The objects in the rearview mirror may appear closer than they are. It's particularly fitting for two layers of this story. One is for my wife, Vicky, for whom these travels to Bulgaria when we went back, were very loaded because her father had never returned in his lifetime. He had very, very wary feelings about Bulgaria, and he never went back. I think he always feared that they still somehow would get him, and or he just didn't want to go back. And so for Vicky, there was a heavy, weighty kind of layer to going back there and to meeting the relatives, most of whom she'd never met before. For her, it is it's a reflection in the rear view that may seem to loom, to use that word again, may seem to loom larger than it really is. And then the second layer of it is, and in a way, that's sort of me sort of trying to grant her some freedom. So some of the you in here is addressed to her. Some of the you is more universal you, if you want freedom, first you find it within, and so, but I also was thinking about Vili, for whom, the idea of Bulgaria and the possibility that they could still be after him followed him his whole life. He never felt fully free of that. He never felt fully safe, and so now I should tell you a little bit about the second half of his life. Much of it was centered around a career as a journalist at Radio Free Europe in the Bulgarian department. And so regularly he was part of a team that was broadcasting anti-communist news and information from the West back into Bulgaria in Bulgarian for Bulgarian listeners who were able to, in certain places, they were able to, Radio Free Europe, I don't know the details of it, but they were able to, to sort of beam their frequency back into countries that were under oppressive regimes, such as Bulgaria was.
So these are illegal broadcasts that are crossing the border.
Yeah.
And received
I would have to do fact check to know whether they would qualify as illegal, but surely they would have been unwelcome to the regime. Yeah. And probably you would have only listened to it in secret, for fear that your neighbors would inform on you, though they listen to Radio Free Europe.
Radio knows no boundaries, broadcast cast abroad. You are the transmission, blazing through the fog.
He was outspoken, and he would have, at that point, if he hadn't been already, he would have absolutely been on the, either imprisonment or even assassination list for the Bulgarian KGB. And it wasn't unprecedented for them to even go after Bulgarians who had managed to escape. And famously, this Bulgarian writer, Georgi Markov, who ended up becoming an enemy of the state, and he managed to escape, but then was infamously assassinated by poison at the end of a dart tip attached to the end of an umbrella. And Vili interviewed his mother for the radio after that happened. I don't know that he ever met Markov himself, but that's just a good point of reference to understand how Vili had good reason to fear. Even though he had managed to escape, he was still doing something that would have angered the regime very much, and he was doing it in a very public way. And, he and all of the other members of the Bulgarian team, I think, felt similarly wary, and there were known to be spies in Radio Free Europe as well. And I think, it's the sense I get is that they all sort of were always careful of the possibility that any of their coworkers could actually be spies or agents of some kind.
Well, let's go from the layers of meaning in the lyrics are so fascinating, and it's great to hear so many of the specifics that inspire these the pieces of the poetry and the pieces of storytelling that run through. Let's talk a little bit more about the music and the production. I was happy actually to hear you bring up hip hop, because I was going to ask about that, and I wasn't sure if you would be surprised that I wanted to talk about hip hop influences in the song, and whether those were there on an aware level or not. I think I certainly hear moments in the instrumental production that remind me of stuff that you and I were listening to back in the 90s, something that like High Tech would have done, or like an Andre 3000 production on Aquemini. And I think there are also things in the lyrics, the dense rhyme patterns, these like alliterative phrases where you've got multiple alliterations packed into a line. So do you see hip hop as an influence in your current Black Bear work, and where is that in this song?
Yeah, without a doubt. I was grinning through most of what you were just saying, and it obviously tickles me to hear you say that, that is in any way reminiscent of an Andre 3000 Aquemini era production or High Tech, which was, for the listener, that was our favorite music when we were 16, 17, 18 years old. And we listened to it together in each other's cars at loud volumes, and occasionally under the influence of certain smoky intoxicants. And I've always known that lyrically, this is true on the Cinnamon phase as well, that lyrically and my lyrical delivery is deeply influenced by hip hop, and I, as well, I was writing rhymes in high school and a little bit into the beginning of college, and I was doing some of that. That was the beginning of my dabbling with song making. It was always just over, instrumentals to pre-existing songs, and I think that's just always stayed with me, even while I've never stopped listening to hip hop. But of course, I then, in college and afterwards, really started getting into more different types of music, particularly a lot of indie rock in the early 2000s. I have a voracious appetite and a relatively wide reaching one when it comes to listening to music. But I've always known that, like, as indie as the Cinnamon phase was in certain ways, that one of the things that's a bit odd about it, and I hope one of the things that's good about it. And, for example, one of the things that brings people to the song Black Bear in droves, much more so than to any of the other songs on the album, is that it has this almost undetectable to somebody who wouldn't necessarily know it. It has this hip hop MC rhyming kind of influence in it, in the delivery.
Nuts that he can shake down from the canopy of trees, and afterwards I'll have his choice from any stream to drink. Well, I fill up another cup from my old kitchen sink, and if he wants he'll have a nap and dream his Black Bear dreams. But I could only dream of like I dream to drink from streams, and as he sleeps he hears the breeze and knows that he is safe, while I'm sleeping with the fan on to drown out my lack of faith. The simplicity of solitude is a hard thing to perfect. Stealing happiness from loneliness is not a simple theft.
So it was that hip hop influence has always been there in my lyrics, even if on certain songs it's not really there. But it's like when I'm writing lyrics in my head, I have to try hard for it not to rhyme, for it not to have alliteration, for it not to have this sort of wordplay. That was one of the things that is one of the things I love so much about hip hop and rhyming in that context. Like if I want to make a song that doesn't have that sort of metered rhyming wordplay to it, I have to sort of work against my natural tendencies, which I like doing. And I'm doing more like some of the forthcoming Black Bear songs. I have a number in the hopper that I'm writing and recording now and have demos of. And I'm trying to get away from that because I'm interested in not getting away from it for good, but just to experiment with getting away from it and be like, what, because there's so many other songs that I love that don't have that, and I don't want to get caught in this place where it's like, I feel like that's all I can do with myself vocally and lyrically. And I sort of like, I can never escape my own sort of the witty MC, the witty teenager MC inside of me, So yeah. And then in terms of the production, yeah, I mean, this song has 808s on it. Like those low kick sounds are actually 808s from the Roland TR-808. which is actually originally the drum beat on this was sort of like a couple of stock drum tracks that I had picked up from Logic and manipulated a bunch to my liking. But I was never happy with the kick sound that I had. And I'd been listening to, I always listen to podcast interviews with artists. When you listen to ones with hip hop or sometimes pop producers, it's like the 808 is basically a foregone conclusion that like the song will have 808s on it, And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to fuck with these 808s and see I've never put that in a track. And so it was my first time, and as soon as I dropped them in, obviously all of these old fuzzy feelings flood into me from a lot of the music that I love, whether it's something like current, like Run the Jewels, or back to Aquemini or Black Star, or I don't know if Black Star would have been using 808s, but so much of that hip hop that I've loved over the years has had that particular sound to it. And it's arguably the most visceral sonic element of the song. So it's definitely it's like the bassiest song I've ever made for that reason. And then there's some percussive elements that are very much almost like trap. And I don't claim to be a scholar of trap by any means, but one of the most identifiable to my ears percussive elements of the last decade, or maybe a little less than that, is these trilly, these high trilly, these very fast hi-hats, or some other kind of high tinny kind of sound, whether it's a hi-hat or a high snare. And so I started messing around with some of these trap loops, and just sort of like certain parts of it that have these high, very quick percussive elements to them, which sort of immediately places them as contemporary. And I don't know if I've just sort of been brainwashed along with everybody else to sort of, that means like it's a hit or something, but yeah, so it has that too. So yeah, I mean, and just the fact that it's the first song that I'm really sampling on is also clearly a hip hop reference and a hip hop influence.
Great. There's at least one other sample that comes through
yes,
in a very beautiful way, right in the closing seconds of the song.
Mm-hmm.
Something that sounds almost to my ears like a choir singing like a hymn in Latin, or
mm-hmm.
it may not be church music, but it made me think about the references to monasteries and orthodoxy earlier in the song. So I'm curious about what that sample is, and whether there's something about the role of religion that we should be taking away as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that sample, believe it or not, is the same sample that is being affected throughout the whole song. I mean, it goes to show sort of how unrecognizable my treatment of the sample was in the end. It turned it into something that just sounds completely different, but which somehow still retains some of the feelings that I love so much in that sample. And I always, in all of the different demo forms that I had of this song, there was always that as the outro. So it could sort of be like an homage to like, this is what you've been hearing all chopped up this whole time, but this is where it came from. And it's from that Bulgarian folk record. And it's a song which is called, the English translation of it, which is on the record, on the sleeve, "Two Huskies Are Coming Toward Us."
Well, I can start to hear both of my kids making some noise from the other end of the apartment, which probably means it's time to come to my last question, which is, I think, a little bit of a pulling back to just a bigger question about artistic direction as it relates to this song. It's a song about freedom. It's about overflowing the borders. So there's an uplifting message, but the themes that run through it are also fairly dark. We're talking about repression and and some of the chord progressions are minor and dark. And you talked about the level of bass. So there's a darkness here that I don't think we ever heard on the Cinnamon Phase. The Cinnamon Phase, that project, the name of it literally refers to a young self, or a coming into being with adulthood self, and now we're a couple decades or a decade and a half past that. So is this Black Bear growing up? Is this a response to the times that we're all living in globally right now? What would you say about that?
I mean, absolutely. It's the subject matter itself lends itself to a kind of darkness because of this weightiness that I told you about it, and the drama and trauma of the story. There was lots of fallout in certain ways. And Vicky's father is no longer with us. It has that weight to it. And as I referred to, our experience in Bulgaria was this really interesting mixture of finding it beautiful and inspiring and super interesting, but also for Vicky especially, there was this haunted kind of feeling. And she even, never quite knew what to make of the few relatives that we were talking with, and she didn't know if people were telling her the full truth about certain things in the family history. So there's weightiness to that whole experience, which was felt by me secondhand, but which I know has always been a part of Vicky's relationship to Bulgaria, and the idea of it as it is sort of triangulated through her father and her grandmother, who lived with her most of her young life. She lived here in this house as well. So there's that. And then I should also say there's another plug moment, because Vicky, of course, is she is the other person that I share my music with the most and my life with the most. And Vicky wrote herself she's a writer, a poet, and she wrote a chapbook called Exile in Orbit, which is about her relationship with her father. It's a mixture of prose and poetry, and it is available on the internet if you find it. So that book, Exile in Orbit, it is also a very strong influence to this song. And I'm glad that it came up in my mind right now to say it before we're finished, because there are certain images in here that are also in Vicky's book, ghost in the graveyard, candles burning over bones, a jungle filled with prayers, lipstick on a stone. This is, there's a poem in Vicky's book called Graves in the Jungle. This image of lipstick on a stone, it's her dad's cousin. I guess that makes it her second cousin, Zornitsa, which is an amazing name in itself. This experience of going to the cemetery to visit the graves of ancestors. And, and her mother, her tombstone had a photo of her on it, like actually affixed to it behind plastic. And, and Zornitsa kissed the photo, and she wears thick lipstick, Zornitsa.
In the graveyard, candles burning over bones, a jungle filled with prayers, lipstick on a stone, a simple meal in a field.
And she, and of course you could see the smudges from previous kisses. And so that's just one little moment, but to say that there are certain images here, things that Vicky and I experienced together, and which both of us found poetic, and which are sort of have been referenced to now, each in their own different ways in her project and now in this one. And then it means the most to her. And it's, she's the only person who really understands every single aspect of it. Now to the question of growing up. Yeah, I mean, I think early Black Bear songs, the darkness that they had was much more solipsistic, right? It was much more like early 20s, relationship lost, feeling aimless, which is, these are some of the themes that make Black Bear, the song, speak to people still. And, and all along, since I put it out, it's always been the song that speaks the most to the most people. And quite often it's young people. It's because that album, as you say, it was called the Cinnamon Phase, because it was made in that phase of one's life. And so the Black Bear, this is how the genesis of the whole Black Bear identity began. I was looking through the North American Guide to Mammals. I think I was at my grandparents' house in New Hampshire a long time ago. And I came across this image of the Black Bear page has this image of the 3 black bears in 3 different colors. And so it's the blue phase, the cinnamon phase, and the black phase. And I just immediately was drawn to this image, which is the image that I then did basically like a colored pencil copy of for the cover of the cinnamon phase, with a little arrow pointing to the cinnamon phase, the cinnamon bear. And so it was a young adult period in my life. And I was dealing with very much, in the throes of young adult struggles. So if there was a darkness, which there was, it was a sort of darkness of a sort of youthful loneliness and the sort of agitation of sort of being in and out of relationships, or feeling unsure about what one is supposed to do with oneself all the time, or where to go in life, or, how to cope with, the first adult feelings of loneliness or young adult feelings of loneliness. And I am now 38 years old, so it's all different. Those problems are not my problems anymore. There are plenty of complex things that are going on both externally and always internally. Like I have what I think of as a really great life, but no matter how great your life is, there are always going to be frictions that exist and things that you can talk about. And I think we all know that more often than not, the most interesting and moving songs are the ones that explore something other than just pure happiness, except for maybe some of the best dance songs might be just about feeling great about the world or feeling great about being you in a certain moment. And those are great too. But of course, that has to come of its own kind of moment. So, when I'm making a list of like, what are things that I could write songs about that would be sort of both interesting to me, both meaningful as well as meaningful to me, and have a sort of complexity that I want to be addressing in my songs right now. And I don't want to pretend for the benefit of my young listeners that those things are still the things that I'm struggling with, like the loss of a young love, like I'm married, I have a 3.5-year-old son. I'm a long ways away from the place that I was while still being the person that I was. I'm a long ways away from the place that I was when I was making that music. So yeah, I have grown up a lot. And I think, the songwriting is more complex than it was back then, because even though I haven't been writing a lot of music in the interim, I've been listening to a ton of music in the interim and listening to a ton of people talk about their creative processes. And I've also been writing a ton. For people who don't know, who are listening to this, I almost sort of think of myself at this point in my life, first and foremost, as a writer. I've been a teacher, a professor of writing at NYU for 10 years, though I have now just left that behind to move here to Germany and to really take a swing at being a person who professionally makes things. But I've been writing a ton. I've been, I'm very much developed as a creative person from that moment when I was making the cinnamon phase. And so it stands to reason that the music that I'm making now is of a different level. Whether or not certain people will like it more or less is ultimately irrelevant. I want people to like it. But I absolutely know that there are plenty of people for whom, the original Black Bear will speak to them more than Black Bear Part 2, because of who they are and where they are in their life and what it feels like.
Thank you, Sam. I know this is not the last time we'll talk about music, but I hope we do it in this format again when the time is right.
Me too, Vern. You did an awesome job. Really, you nailed it. Clearly, you've been listening to a lot of podcasts and interviews as well.
I have.
Yeah. I have one there. I realized there's one thing you had asked me. You said, should in advance, you said, should you write any of the questions or should, do you want to see the questions? And we ultimately decided no, that the questions should all be your questions and that I shouldn't know what they are in advance. But the one thing that I do want to just quickly share, because it's a little Easter egg that I love, is this sound that occurs as you're coming out of the verse and going into the pre-chorus. It's actually a field recording that I made. It's like when practically everything drops out and then you just hear this sort of cracking sound. Do you know the sound I'm referring to?
Yeah, it's almost like a soda opening or something like that.
That's interesting to hear. So what it is, and this actually, I recorded this only a few days before, like in the last days of December before releasing it. We went to a pond near here, and the edge of it was iced over with ice about 2 inches thick. And so I took a chunk of this ice. We were doing it with, Nico and Vicky and Ingrid, we were all together. And so we were taking chunks of this ice and throwing it up into the air and letting it smash on the other ice. And then the ice pieces then run across the surface of the ice, which is what you're hearing. And so then I thought, this sound is so fantastic. It's like such an utterly satisfying physical sound that I was like, okay, everybody shut up for a second. I'm going to record a few of these just on my iPhone. And that's what that sound is. And I just want everybody who's listening to this to know that.
That's amazing. I'm so glad you included that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for being not only such a great question asker, but such a patient listener, and for letting me just go on all of my hopefully meaningful tangents.
My pleasure. I know that a lot of people are going to enjoy having so many aspects of this illuminated and just other understanding of your life, your families, and the geopolitical history that it fits into. Thanks.
I hope so. Thank you so much, and love to your family and your kids who are rustling on the other side of the apartment. And
love right back to you from Brooklyn.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Talk to you soon.
Bye, Vern.